Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Eastman. I'm a professor of history at Virginia Commonwealth University and the president-elect of SHEAR, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. And right at the top, I want to thank Christina Stanchu and Ellie Musgrave of the VCU Humanities Research Center for helping us organize and stage this webinar. And so to begin, I wanted to say that for about a year now, a group of us have been developing a new mentorship program at SHEAR to be named for Jan Ellen Lewis. And let me scan down there. So Jan was a professor and dean at the Newark campus of Rutgers University. She was a president of SHEAR, an extraordinary research scholar, and a mentor and advisor to countless students and colleagues. And I can honestly say that I was not a student of Jan's, but I might not be a professor today if it weren't for Jan's mentorship. So I feel especially dedicated to developing a program that truly tries to address the many social and intellectual challenges in today's scholarly landscape. And I have to say that in the weeks leading up to today's program, I've received a lot of notes from people who knew Jan and still miss her, and who've commented that considering all that she did for so many of us, this is a terrific way to honor her legacy. So with that said, today's conversation is not oriented to any particular conference, even though our SHEAR conference is coming up in mid-July and we really hope you'll come. The reason for today's webinar is that we know that conferences can be anxiety-producing, alienating, and expensive. All the more reason that we really hope that this program can help people get the most out of these events. And we are so grateful today to have as our two hosts brilliant people who know how to conference. So let me introduce the redoubtable Honor Sachs is a scholar of early America, gender, slavery, and the law, a professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder. She's the author of the prize-winning book, Home Rule: Households, Manhood, and National Expansion on the 18th Century Kentucky Frontier. And she's currently developing a new book on multiple generations of an enslaved family in Virginia that sued for freedom based on their mixed race lineage. That is, they descended from free indigenous people, which was the basis for their freedom. Also, let me say, there are a lot of reasons to follow Honor on social media, but one of the best reasons is to see pictures of her beautiful pooch, Ruthie. And Will Mackintosh is a cultural and social historian whose work has analyzed some of the most delightful aspects of the 19th century United States: the history of leisure and the history of crime, just to name two of them. He also studies the decidedly less delightful but eminently important cultural history of capitalism. He's a professor at the University of Mary Washington, and he's the author of the fabulous book, Selling the Sights: The Invention of the Tourist in American Culture. And he's currently developing a new project on the Loomis Gang, a highly organized group of horse thieves. You heard it, horse thieves in New York State. He's also the former editor of The Panorama, which is a terrific online source for offering expansive views of the history of the early American Republic. And as a member of the Fredericksburg, Virginia City Council, an elected member, no less, he works hard coming up with pragmatic solutions to the problems we face in civic society today. So just one quick note about the format here. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be listening to Will and Honor going back and forth on talking about some of their strategies and ideas, after which they will take questions. So please drop your questions into the Q&A section. And in the meantime, Will and Honor, take it away.
Okay, should I go first, Honor?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I think Honor and I were chatting about this before it started, right? And we, in the spirit of Jan Lewis and the way she used to attend conferences, right? Where this is really where we want to keep our conversation today kind of really focused on how to be a conference attendee, right? More so than a presenter, right? What is it that you how is it that you can get the most intellectually and socially out of conference attendance? And I want to start by talking for a few minutes about how I think about the problem of being a conference attendee from the kind of intellectual side, right? Because conferences, in my experience, I really like drinking from a fire hose, right? It's like no matter how broad or how narrow the kind of thematic scope of the conference is, like no matter what, it's just going to be like way more information about way more things than you can ever possibly take in. So I think that for me, it's about managing how you actually like get something out of that fire hose that's like pointed at you all the time. And the other thing I think, frames the way I think about attending conferences, right, is that like conference papers themselves are like a really weird genre, particularly as historians do them. They're presented verbally, like a lesson, right? In that way, they're more sort of like a lecture you would give in a classroom. But they're also meant to present cutting edge research to an audience of specialists. So they're like also incredibly dense, right? So like they have, for me, I've always thought of them as sort of like a weird sort of hybrid offspring of like written scholarship and a lecture, but like in some ways with the worst aspects of both rather than the best aspects of both, right? Like the worst aspects of a spoken lecture in the sense that like you as the audience can't control the time or the pacing or the rate at which you consume the information. It's just being like sort of shot towards you. But it's also got the sort of the density and the detail and the specificity and the nuance of cutting edge written scholarship. So it's like a genre that if you take the like most inconvenient part, it's like the format, the medium and the message like don't really fit each other in a conference paper. And I think like the historians are actually we're the worst about this, given our kind of culture around like writing out conference papers and then reading them. I think that just like makes it that much worse. Um, so I think you have to be really um, sort of, or for me, I've always tried to be really um, sort of strategic and a little bit almost like surgical about how I engage with conferences as an intellectual experience. So I want to talk a little bit about how I sort of decide what panels to attend, right? Because at most conferences, there will be multiple panels happening at any given moment. And so you can't go to everything, right? So you have to be making choices. And I try to sort of pick like conference panels from like three buckets. One is like things that are related to something I'm working on now, where I want to be hearing about what other scholars working on related topics are doing right now, and making those relationships and building those, putting faces to names and that kind of thing. Then I kind of pick some from the bucket of things that play a role in my teaching life. So there are things that I'm not necessarily working on directly myself, but that I know are things that are questions or topics that I engage with in the classroom a lot. Because I can sometimes, like as a way of keeping current with what people are working on those topics that you aren't kind of directly working on yourself. And then the third bucket is just like things I think are cool, right? Like stuff I'd never thought of, or just that seem really interesting, or I think that maybe that's not like a very satisfying way to describe it, but just like things I think are cool, right? And I try to do like a little bit like pull from all three buckets and mix those up a little bit, so that I'm not just overdosing on one bucket, right? Like I don't want to only go to things that are related to topics I'm writing on because I'll just like burn out over the course of a conference, right? Um, or I don't want to just go to like things I think are cool because it'll, might just be kind of random at that point. So I try to like um, pull from those three different buckets, and like balance the panels that I want to attend amongst those three things. And I try to make a plan ahead of time. Like if you get the conference program online ahead of time, or at the very least when I first get there, spend that first evening, take an hour and kind of look through it and circle the things so that I have like sort of a plan of attack. And the other thing I would say about that is like you don't have to go to everything, right? Like you should also give yourself like conference sessions off, right? And if it's a choice between attending a panel, um, even one that is like very closely related to what you do and like having lunch with like a new friend you just made that you might have interesting conversations with, like I would choose the lunch every single time, right, over the conference panel, because I just think like you are going to ultimately like learn more, and you are going to grow more intellectually from the informal lunch conversation with someone who is, you're smart and interesting and that you're vibing with, than you will from like three 15-minute conference papers, right? So yeah, you also have to like give yourself time off, right? For sure. And then like when you actually get to the panel, right, it's usually somewhere between, I mean, it depends. It can be like 2 to 3 15-minute papers. It can be a round table where everyone's like talking for a shorter time and then there's a conversation. Like there's all kinds of different formats, and like different conferences do these things really differently too. Um, but again, right, like it's going to be more information and like more like dense information that at least I can digest sitting there, in a uncomfortable chair in a hotel conference ballroom, and certainly like at the end of the day, like I'm not absorbing information that quickly at all. So I try to think about them like kind of historiographically a little bit, right? Like instead of trying to retain the details of what I'm learning in all these papers, because that's like not going to happen. I try to think about like, okay, what are the big themes that are coming across these papers? What are the big themes also like that I think are like emerging across the course of the conference itself, right? For me, like the 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 intellectual work that attending a conference done is less like retaining details about scholars' emerging work and more about like, okay, what are people interested in these days? What are the trends in the field? Like, what's the directions where people are going? What are the kinds of questions that are engaging people? What new chronologies or geographies are sort of like hot and interesting right now? Um, and so I think like the conference, I kind of think of a conference as like being, to quote Elle Woods, like it's a little bit Monet, right? Whereas like when I try to get into the details, I get totally lost and it gets muddy. But then like the goal is when I leave the conference, I want to have kind of like just a like an overall the picture, the details fade and get kind of hazy, but I have an overall picture of like, okay, so this is sort of what people are thinking about right now. This is what people are talking about right now. Like, um, you know, emerging scholars like grad students and early career scholars are headed in this direction, right? Here's the kinds of things that senior scholars are working on right now and how they're thinking about, maybe tying bows on their careers, that kind of thing, right? So like the idea is more like not to like have each of the individual water lilies, but like you have the image of like what the garden looks like, you know what I mean, when you leave. I sit there and take like pages of notes often and then like never look at them again because they are not necessarily useful to me a month or 2 months or 6 months later, right? Like I can't recall the details of what people have talked about in the moment. But like what that allows me to do is to step back and like feel like I sort of have my finger on the pulse of like what's vibrant in our field right now. Where is the field going, right? What kind of questions seem settled? What kinds of questions seem emergent, right? And as just a kind of like note of transition to hand this over to Honor now, um, I think that also for me is really important for the social aspect of the conferences too, right? That like when you're find yourself standing in a group of people in the evening reception that you don't know very well, right? Like the conversation is not usually revolving around, a specific detail of a specific paper that you saw in the 11:30 a.m. session, right? It's sort of like, oh, here are the, people seem to be talking, New Orleans is really hot right now. Why is everybody working on New Orleans, right? Or, whatever it is, right? The sort of the big picture things that you're taking away. So I think that that's actually really helpful in terms of like building the social relationships too. So with that, I just kind of want to turn it over to you, Honor. I don't know if I took my full 15 minutes, but that's okay, right?
That's
Maybe?
okay.
Yeah. All right.
I'm always full of words, so so maybe I can take. We'll see how I stick to the time. Welcome everybody. I can't see you out there. I'm so glad that you chose to show up on this afternoon, and I wish I could. I'm really interested in learning from you guys and to hear what questions and concerns you have about your conference experiences. So I'll give you a little bit of mine, and then hopefully we can hasten into the Q&A, because I think you are the future of the organization. So I'm really excited to hear from you. I wanted to talk, I guess, a little bit about how to find your place socially and intellectually at conferences, not just SHEAR. I mean, SHEAR has over the years, I've gone to a lot of different kinds of conferences, and SHEAR has really become my intellectual home. My first, it's a little embarrassing, but my first SHEAR was in the 90s, 1999, I believe. It was in Lexington, Kentucky. And so I've had this, I was still a master's student, um, and it was a really good experience. I was terrified. My paper was fine. It wasn't great. I actually got torn to shreds by my comments, but I didn't care, because all I felt at the moment was I just gave my first conference paper without puking, and that was really all I needed to get through. For a long time, I didn't come to SHEAR because of, well, I was in graduate school. I didn't have a lot of summer funding. We didn't have a lot of support from the University of Wisconsin. And then I was really professionally precarious for almost a decade, and I never really knew where my funding was going to come from. So I kind of bowed out of conferences other than the big ones, the AHA, because that was back when we still did interviews at the AHA. So it wasn't really until I sort of had more secure funding that I needed to find more of an intellectual home. I started coming to SHEAR again, and have really sort of come back year after year, as sort of a grounding place for me. It's a intellectually safe space, as the kids say these days, and this is where my friends are. So over the years, I've developed this relationship with SHEAR that's been really rewarding. I don't want to flood the zone here with toxic positivity. I don't want to say everything's great, you'll be fine. I am the first person to admit that conferences are taxing. They're physically exhausting. After a weekend at a conference, I always come home and crash for a couple days. They're emotionally sort of fraught, especially when you're just kind of more junior and you're trying to navigate these professional relationships. And if you're anything like me, every interaction has like, a post-mortem analysis of all the things I said wrong and what I should have done better and why am I such an idiot. And, there's a lot of that going on. And maybe that's just me. Maybe you're very confident. I am, even though I tend not to play one in my job, I am an introvert by nature. If I see somebody that I want to talk to, chances are I'm gonna like run and hide because I'm too scared. When we talked about putting this panel together, Will became our resident extrovert, and I became the resident introvert. So we have the two sides of the social spectrum. I have a low social battery, and that's hard. Some of you out there might be in a similar straits, but that's in some ways why I find the SHEAR community so, or have found the SHEAR community so welcoming, is because it's familiar now. And so I can shed a little bit of that professional anxiety. These people have over the years become friends, and that's really, that's helped me recharge. I will say, even though, so that's my sort of, preface on how, I acknowledge and respect how difficult conferences can be. However, I would also argue that right now, in particular, in this year, 2025, we need these kinds of communities more than ever. That in a lot of ways, we live in this constant, sort of state of dissonance between, watching the institutions that we are often associated with, or, the institutions that are holding our nation together are sort of crumbling, are fragile, are busting at the seams, and yet we're also at the same time trying to maintain professional normalcy, and that's really difficult to square those two things happening at once. What's the point of going and hearing a conference paper when the world is on fire? But I actually find that in some ways it's really affirming, really important to reconnect with what I really value, which is the intellectual work, the intellectual community, like-minded people. That the only way we're going to get through this moment is by leaning on each other and working in collaboration and strategizing collectively how to get through this. So I think in some ways, that's important to keep in mind when you're in moments of despair and existential dread, that in fact connecting with other human beings is truly the most important thing that we can do to help survive that. Let's see. I also, SHEAR has really become a welcoming place. In many ways, I also have gravitated towards other professional organizations for exactly this reason. I often go regular to the Western History Association, not because I actually find much on the program that is useful to me. I actually find there's disappointingly very little early American history at the Western History Association, but it's such a good quality conference in terms of the social project that they are creating. They've done a lot of self-reckoning and self-examination. They're really inclusive. They invite a lot of people in, and I enjoy the general environment of those spaces. And so I gravitate towards those sort of places because in many ways that's what my soul, my heart, my mind needs right now. A little bit about how do you navigate sort of the social landscape of the conference itself? How do you walk through the hallway? How do you talk to people? How do you find your friends? A couple stories about this right now. I mean, obviously, you are, well, I don't know who's out there, but I'm assuming that a lot of people, and I know that a lot of people that you're trying to invite to these kinds of events are the future of SHEAR. I hope that a lot of you are going to be first time presenters at this conference, maybe first time attendees. Some of you are veterans, but still in graduate school. Some of you are early career, not really sure what the demographics of the group is. But, obviously find your community, find your people, attend the panel, make those lunches happen, create a pod, create a community in which you can talk about what's coming next for the next year, what kinds of professional concerns you have. I will also say that, meeting, at least for me personally, meeting those scholars that you really admire, the senior scholars, the people who've been around the block a few times, that's actually really important. Don't repeat, I guess this is being recorded, but I really find the mid-career scholars are the least helpful at a conference for some reason. They're the most professionally anxious because they're trying to finish their first books. They've got so much sort of professional anxiety. The senior scholars actually tend to be a little more inviting of the next generation, or at least they should be. In some ways, I should recommend to Caroline and the organizers to maybe do a session like this for longtime SHEAR members, like how to invite younger scholars into your networks. I'll just tell one story and then I'll probably end there. But I pretty much, I think, credit being here today to an encounter with a very senior scholar that I admired, way back when I was just a baby. When I was in graduate school. I was not even a PhD candidate. I was still working on my master's thesis, and I went to a conference. It was not a SHEAR. It was a very niche conference on 18th century frontiers, and it was in Virginia, right up my alley. I went to this conference. I was, super young, starting out, grad student. Really didn't know where I was going with my master's thesis, and was at kind of a moment um, in my training where I really genuinely thought that I was not right for this profession. I was ready to drop out. I couldn't find my people. I couldn't find weirdos like myself. I couldn't find people who were willing to sort of be super out there and creative. And I just didn't think that I was going to find my place. And it was a fascinating conference. Like I said, there were a lot of very anxious mid-career scholars who were talking to each other. And I ended up at an evening event sitting at a table with somebody who I'd read in my very first seminar in graduate school. I ended up sitting next to Peter Wood, yes, who was a very, senior scholar um, on South Carolina and the African slave trade. And I we sat and we just talked all night, and he seemed so excited about the younger generation of scholars. He was really creative. He was doing these interesting projects. He was writing a children's book, and I was just it was like so energizing to realize, oh, if this guy can be in the profession, maybe there's a place for me, right? Maybe meeting this person who's written these really creative works, who, is still willing to talk to somebody who has no idea what she's doing. Um, I felt, in some ways, like if somebody like this, somebody who I admire from afar, somebody whose works I've read, can be kind and creative and interesting, maybe there's more people out there that will help me find a sense of place in this world. So in many ways, that was really pivotal. And just to bring it full circle, when I did my interview at University of Colorado Boulder, there was Peter Wood sitting in the front row, and I was just like, I just wanted to like reach out and like hug my younger self and be like, it's going to be okay. Like these are pivotal moments here. Just stick with the program. So that's my advice in many ways. Find your people intellectually among your peers. Cultivate those relationships with an eye towards taking the reins of the organization in the future. But also find your people among those scholars that you admire. Sometimes you'll meet them and you'll realize this isn't a very nice person. I really admire their work, but I don't think that this is somebody that I can like really lean on as a mentor. But find the people that you feel like you're comfortable and that speak to the kinds of work that you're trying to do. But mostly, I'm going to wrap it up there and just say I'm really, I don't want to be in a position where I'm talking to you and telling you what to do. I am really curious to hear what your concerns are coming into the profession and coming into these conferences for the first time. So I'm very excited to hear what kinds of questions you have for us.
Can I just say something about that really resonated with what Honor just said for me?
Mhm.
Um, I think one of the really important things I think there's something about this profession and this field that can make you feel like a disembodied brain, right? Where you are nothing more or less than the sum of your ideas or the sum of your scholarship. Um, and it's not that the quality of your scholarship doesn't, or the fact of your scholarship or the fact of your ideas doesn't matter. But like we are all obviously much more than that. And what Honor said about needing to find community, particularly in these times, but I think in all times, right? And this for me is what's so powerful, I think often about conferences and really what defines them as critical to this life, right? Is that it's the opportunity in which you get to meet the people as like full human beings rather than disembodied ideas or disembodied interactions with the archive or whatever, right? And that many of my most important professional friendships, right, emerged out of shared intellectual intellectual concerns, of course, right? But like a lot of them emerged out of like purely human points of connection that I discovered in the context of that, right? Like we have kids the same age, right? Or like, dogs that are similarly fluffy, to translate it into honors language, right? Or whatever. Like other aspects of our identity are shared, right? As like a member of the LGBT community, right? That like you wouldn't necessarily know who is a member of that community just from reading their books, but at conferences you totally do, and like you're not going to necessarily be best friends, but like yeah, that then all of a sudden becomes an important part of building relationships with people, or you happen to like live near each other or whatever, right? And so I think like what that's what really resonated with me about what Honor was saying is that like conferences are the space where you take like disembodied brains and turn them into full human beings. And it's like the full human being part is actually the basis of the relationship as much as the disembodied brain part, right? And it's like really important to resist that. That like to the extent that there are things about the academy I don't like, right? It is that inclination to treat each other and judge each other and assess each other and rank each other and qualify each other as these sort of like disembodied brains rather than just like human beings, right? Who like share interests and like to talk to each other about them. You know what I mean? Yeah.
This has been so great so far. Thank you both so much. And we have a couple of questions, one of which dovetails with something that I was going to say. So, I'm going to briefly tell you about my first conference, which was held in Boston, and a really important scholar in my field was there whose work I had really admired. And I went up to him at one of the receptions and introduced myself. And he sort of looked at my name tag and then looked away for anyone else to talk to. And this dovetails with something that an anonymous attendee just asked, which is sometimes you see at conferences scholars engaged in conversation. After all, they might not have seen each other since the last meeting. Is it okay to hover nearby and wait to talk to them once they finish? Or should you try to insert yourself in the conversation? Or, I mean, how do you talk to people you would like to meet and you would like to talk with?
But I can give you the extrovert's answer, which is just like march up to them. I mean, I don't know. Maybe this is a better question for Honor to field. But the one thing I would say is that um, like 90% of the time, the other person is just as weird and scared as you are, right? And that like what appears as bluster or confidence or comfort, right? In that context could just be long-time familiarity, or it could be bluster, right? It could be you fake it till you make it. And so like I think it's one of those things where it is always good to remind yourself that no matter the air of confidence or belongingness that other people might project in that space, right? Like 95% of the time, they're just as weird and shy and awkward on the inside as you are. So I try to keep that in the back of my mind too, right? And like the person who's like running away from you actively, like Carolyn just talked about, like they're the minority, right? And again, right, like it's important to talk to people and build a relationship with people that you have shared intellectual interests with. But like for me, the answer is always like also try to connect with them as a person too, right? Like, oh, like, oh, so you live in like, Florida, right? You must be cold here in this winter. Whatever, right? Like dumb, like small talk that you would make in any event, right? Like, and I think that works a lot of the time, honestly, right?
Yeah, that's why I said that, perhaps we should have a session for, for regular SHEAR attendees, like don't be jerks. Part of what we're doing here is like trying to, really encourage, and be welcoming of the next generation of conference attendees. I mean, I will say, it's really hit or miss, and having met scholars who gave me sort of a cold shoulder because they were in the middle of some drama that I was not privy to, like for a brief moment, that would make me feel sort of intimidated and nervous and scared and whatever. But, that's sometimes you step on those social landmines and, it doesn't work out. But, for the most part, I can tell you from experience, um, we are so excited, or like at least I am, like, if anybody, to know that anybody has read my work. If somebody, if you read something by somebody you really want to meet, and you come up to them and you tell them you read their book, I mean, that's it, that works. That's a way in. Like, it's very, flattery will work. You can talk about how, tell them, meeting them alone, just on your own is not enough. It's, in some ways, you have to sort of explain, like, why is this person meaningful to me? And that stuff goes far.
Oh, thank you both so much. Okay, so we have a comment from Lindsay Schackenbach Regula. Thank you, Lindsay. She is recalling her first shear, really experiencing it as overly clicky, which I think is something that happens at many conferences. People see their longtime friends and get together, and it just seems like how does a shy person navigate this? She said that she felt terrified by the clickiness of it. She wound up going back to her hotel room and bursting into tears the first night, which is something that the shy people amongst us can really sympathize with. So, are there any strategies that you can offer for overcoming, especially those initial outsider feelings that some of us introverts have?
I feel like that's a question for me.
Extroverts might not cry, but like I think that I feel that too. Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah.
yeah. No, I get that. And I actually really, um, I use my hotel room time wisely. Like, I need to, even if it's just coming back to my hotel room for like 5 minutes to just like breathe. I do that a lot. Um, I, in some ways, the clickiness, the sort of who knows who and who is friends with who and how do you bust, this is just off the top of my head, but one of the ways for shy people to sort of look like they know what they're doing and to potentially run into people who also are similarly lost is to walk around the book displays. Like, whenever I don't know quite who to hang out with or what I'm doing or why I'm not at the bar like all the cool kids, like, I go to the book display and I look around, and inevitably I end up running into a low stakes, low key conversation. So that's a great place to go if you're just looking to, sort of, have the appearance of not being on the outside, right? Um, Also, and I don't know how really to conceptualize this or to put this into practice, but imagine your own clicks. In some ways, I kind of feel like Sheer would really benefit from more structured communities of like-minded and similarly interested people, whether that's scholars of color or people who are working on indigenous history or people who are I've constantly threatened to create it informally exists, but I like the rhyming nature of it, but I want Shears Queers to be a thing, and have receptions, and if you have a particular area that you feel you want to create community, try to imagine ways in which you can facilitate that so you have those communities. So I'm all for creating. I don't want exclusive clickiness, but I want to have more sort of targeted groupings of people who are in community and in conversation, so that you all have, knitting groups, I don't know, like, people who enjoy doing, like-minded things in your downtime. Often, and also I'll say this, because I know that this has come up in various sort of focus group conversations. There is a problem I don't know if it's a problem, but it's a definite culture at conferences, not just SHEAR, but at conferences in generally of, um, you know, the bar clicks, right? That's where people go. People go to the bar. Not everybody wants to go to the bar, right? Not everybody enjoys drinking. Not everybody can drink, you know, there's all sorts of reasons. So in many ways, people tend to sometimes feel a little bit excluded. And I'm all for, you know, one of the things SHEAR did last year or the year before. No, it was last year. The local arrangements community, they had this great section in the back of the program where all the local arrangements people, you know, listed their favorite restaurants and their favorite coffee shops, you know, and I'm all for creating, coffee groups or, small, breakout sessions that aren't necessarily going to be those most visible, clicky factions.
The thing I think about clickiness real quick, right, is I'm not saying that that's not a problem at conferences, but I also don't think it's like a unique problem with conferences in the sense that like it's the same problem of building social relationships in a new context that you would face in like any other aspect of your life, right? Like if you like decided you wanted to go join the volleyball team league in your town, right? And you showed up and like all the people knew each other because they'd been playing volleyball for a while and you would, make some connection with one person and then that would build into a relationship with another person, right? And it's like in a context like that, you wouldn't expect your community to emerge like immediately and organically. Like you would expect it to be like a project that you would have to, the construction of a community is like a self-conscious project that you have that would take time to do, right? Or like think about, I mean, I know people in this field, this is going to be something that probably resonates with a lot of you, right? It's like when you move to a new town and you don't know anybody, right? Whether it's for grad school or a job or whatever, a relationship, right? And then you have to, and you have to do that same project again of like sort of starting from scratch and building a connection with one person and then another other person and then another person, right? And like, I think conferences, like people react really strongly to the clickiness of them because um, they're sort of these exceptional spaces. And also because they feel so fraught and heavy with sort of professional success and failure, right? It's like the clickiness of it feels like it carries a lot of like weight on like how your life is going to turn out. And I get that. And I think, I think that is, I totally understand that feeling, but I would encourage people to sort of think about it the same way you would think about like how you go about building relationships and community in any kind of new context that you get dropped into, right? Which is that like we all started going to a conference one point and not knowing anybody, right? Um, and like like then you end up with a community over time, right? It's a thing that happens, right? And so I guess maybe like patience is what I'm saying, right? And also like to the extent that you can demystify the conference as some sort of exceptional social space and just treat it as any other kind of novel social space that you're walking into, and think about using those same strategies that you would in any right like when you go join the volleyball league in the new town you move to, right, which is you like find someone who seems friendly and you like talk to them till you find some point of connection, and and then like you nurture that little seedling of connection and you grow it and you grow it and you grow it into a community, and like that's all conferences are too, right? And Honor and I have just been doing it for 20 or 25 years, right? So like I'm sorry not to out you or whatever, but like, well, you outed yourself about the 90s, so that's fine.
Yeah.
Right. It's like we've just had a longer time to nurture those seedlings, but that's what it is. And it's this, and when I think about it that way, I'm like, oh, so conferences are less scary because they're just the same thing you would do in any other context of your life, which is like treat it as like a problem to be solved and you go and work on it, right?
This is why you're on city council, Will.
Why?
Solving problems.
Oh, yeah, solving problems. Yes.
Figure out how to solve them.
Right.
So I love this. And this actually feeds into another question from Lisa Vatier, asking for advice and suggestions about the Q&A after each panel. And it occurs to me that one of the ways that I started finding my people at conferences was I would, for whatever reason, really a certain paper, a certain presenter, their work, their ideas, the way they thought would really resonate with me. And I would go up to them afterward if I wasn't able to ask a question during the session, and I would tell them how much I enjoyed their paper, and I would ask them if we could keep talking at the reception that night. And that meant that I had someone I could look for in the reception. So rather than feeling like a wallflower or completely out of my depth, or instead of feeling like I should run off to the hotel room or whatever, I had someone I could talk to. And then usually that was a way to meet a couple of other people along the way, right? So, and it's also a way to meet people who are part of your sort of general cohort. So if you're a relatively new professor, or if you are in the alt-ac world, or if you are a grad student, you can find other grad students and other alt-ac people through that kind of a thing. Okay, so
Yeah, to add to that,
yeah,
to
yeah.
Lisa's question, right, is that like I'm sure you guys have noticed if you've been to any conferences at all that the Q&As are often a performance, right? They are that it is often the questions are as much designed to demonstrate the smartness of the questioner rather than to elicit further conversation, right? A lot of the time. And so I think Caroline's advice is really, really good, right? Which is like if you actually want to talk to the presenter of the paper and you actually want to discuss their work and you actually have a question, like going up to them afterwards or taking that conversation into a more one-on-one kind of context is you're going to learn a lot more, right? Um, and it also, right, it's that first tendril of social connection, which is like that little, sort of seedling that you can potentially nurture. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so a couple of other questions. One is about how many conferences should you go to? Because, in the old days, the notion of conference hopping was a real thing. That was the way you sort of built your presence in the field and so on. But now that none of us has any money to do anything ever, maybe going to a lot of conferences isn't the right answer. But yeah, so do you guys have an idea about the number of conferences that one maybe can attend productively? Or is that just a matter of the person's own sort of ability to stomach it?
Yeah, I think I mean, that's such an individual uh, question. I mean, if you have a really heavy teaching load, you can't do that. I mean, there was a time when I was trying to hit them all. The fall was always just so crowded. The Southern and the legal historians and the ethnohistory and the Western. I mean, it was crazy. And sometimes I'd try to cram them all in, and I not only can I not afford to do that anymore, but my body can't do it. So you you really kind of have to figure out which one. I mean, you can try in some ways. Pick. Let me see. There's a senior scholar who advised, I think, wisely on the rule of three, and that is sort of annually pick three things that you can do, sort of in different categories. Like pick a conference, agree to a peer review or something. Or some sort of other service position. Pick three things that you can reasonably do. If you don't have anybody asking you to do a peer review of an article, then um, do two conferences. But basically, don't commit to more than three things a year. If you want to do no other service whatsoever and just hop to three different conferences, that's fine. But three is sort of the holy trinity of bandwidth. um, and of course it all depends on the kind of funding. But once you can try to move around. See if you feel more at home at the Southern. See if you find, or if you are more at home at the OAH. I mean, something like that. And then once you find the place of critical mass where your people are, stick with that. But I do think that the rule of three, like you can't overextend much beyond three very taxing annual events.
And I think that this is a question that probably has a theoretical answer, but that almost none of us are in a practical material position to explore those limits, right? Like, like the number of conferences that I'm going to get my institution to fund for me to attend, particularly if I'm not presenting.
Right.
There may be a theoretical upper limit there that where I would get diminishing returns and it would distract me from other things and that kind of thing. But like practically speaking, I'm not going to reach that limit. And my guess is that most of us are being supported or not supported by institutions that are similar in the sense that like, as many as they can pay for you to get to, because I think there are very, very few of us anymore that are employed by institutions that have the kind of resources where you could actually explore the theoretical upper limit, right? Of what you can do. That would be I'm not sure it's worth worrying about in a world of limited resources. Yeah.
Well, this actually is a very helpful question from Gail Coleman. She said, this isn't exactly the purpose of this session, but how can you use conference attendance to actually build a panel for the future? Like, how could you attend a conference this summer and find people to form a panel for proposal for the next summer or something like that?
I can take that one because I co-chaired the program committee last year. And yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. I mean, obviously going to the conference is a good way to shop around for potential co-panelists. You know, finding people whose work you like, finding, being in conversation with people. Um, we also, I don't know how successful it was last year, but we did an online sort of like, find other panelists, like Excel spreadsheet kind of thing where we just posted the link online so people could list what they were interested in and then potentially find co-panelists. It is always better to submit a panel to the program committee rather than a single paper. But I will say, in full disclosure, and this is not just unique to SHEAR, this is across the board, even the large organizations, submissions are dropping for all these reasons, mostly because of resources. So even if we got lots of single panel submissions, we as co-chairs of the program committee worked really hard to make sure those people got onto the program. We'd create panels, we'd even create part of a panel and then engineer somebody else to come in. We'd find chairs, we'd find comments. I think there is in this age of sort of declining resources, there's a real effort. The program committee is really making an effort to figure out ways to make sure if you have an idea that you get on the program. But I think shopping around for a future panel at the conference is really good. The other thing, if I don't know how many graduate students are out there in the audience, but those graduate student seminars that happen ahead of the conference. Those are I've done those. I've led those. Those are a really good way to find potential other people who are working on your field So those are a number of options that I would suggest.
I've always found the key for me is being like really, really flexible and creative about what kind of connections my work can make and what kind of questions it can answer. Because when I've been on, when I have successfully speed dated my way to a conference panel, it's often I often am able to it has happened because I've been able to say, hey, my work, I'm working on horse thieves, but like it actually raised this sort of like constitutional law question that like in my own work I don't really engage with, but I know it's sort of there. But then there's these other people who are dealing with that sort of constitutional law question. So sure, I'll talk about what my horse thieves can say about that constitutional law question, right? So I think that like for me, always the trick for finding them has been to be like sort of very loosey-goosey and creative about what my work, quote unquote, actually is, right? Because the likelihood of finding other people who are working on topics that like really mesh tightly with the main questions and the main currents that you're writing about, I think is often fairly small, right? particularly if you have kind of a niche topic or whatever. So it's like looking at thematic connections or maybe methodological connections with other people's work, right? Or wait questions that your work touches on that you don't really engage with that much necessarily in your own writing, but which you might have 15 minutes worth of something to say about, right? And so I think you just have to be really, really creative, open-minded, and flexible about what the scope of your work actually is in order to make those connections. Which is a little bit my hesitation about doing too many conference papers to begin with, right? Because the number of conference papers that I've written that have actually turned into something more meaningful afterwards is like relatively small for me. I think it's different for other people, but for me, it's really small because I almost always have to follow some tangent in order to make my work connect to the other work on the panel, and then that ends up being a tangent that I don't really follow elsewhere necessarily.
Well, okay, so I'm going to follow up on something that Honor brought up earlier. You mentioned that at your first conference, your paper sort of got ripped to shreds by the commentator or the Q&A or whatever. And so, but anticipating that kind of an experience, how can you deal with the anxiety of questions that really challenge or undermine your work, or questions that you just don't have answers for, right? So how do you sort of deal with that level of anxiety?
Well, I mean, I do think some level of anxiety is good. The anxiety that, that first paint that for that first paper, forced me to read it 100 times ahead of time. I mean, I was nervous, and so I just read it and read it and read it. And, I don't do that anymore. But that anxiety, got me ready, got me prepared. And that's why I was proud that I hadn't thrown up on the lectern when I gave my paper. Um, I, this is a very, very practical kind of suggestion, but have some allies, plant some allies for you in the audience. That same paper where I was ripped to shreds, and again, it for some reason didn't bother me. For one, I really was proud of the work. I thought it had a good argument, and I thought that the comment like didn't get it, and that was okay. But I had one person who was a scholar that I admired, that I'd talked to a lot about the project, who was sitting in the audience. And when I was finished with that project, with giving my paper and I concluded, I just I looked over at her and she just gave me a nod, just the subtlest. You did it. That was good. And it was just, I mean, that was like a prophylactic. Like you could have hurled any kind of insult at me after, because I'm just like, I just got a nod, and it was like, so have some people that are on your team who you respect, do your due diligence to make sure that you're going into that feeling confident. It doesn't mean, I mean, a conference is a place where you're trying out ideas, and that's okay. So you can have flaws, and you can be willing to sort of say, oh yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of thinking about that question when I came to this conclusion. So thanks. So embracing that aspect, but also, knowing that, having some people there to support you, who you respect, who have your back, is quite useful.
The only thing I would add to that is that if you can't recruit allies to go, you can always make them afterwards, right? Because in my experience, if someone is being a jerk to you, it's probably obvious to everybody else that they're being a jerk to. And when I've had those, like probably everybody else in the room is like, wow, that person's being a jerk, right? Or at least a lot of other people are. And so when I've had, I don't think, I'm not sure I've had an experience quite as bad as honors, but I've definitely had moments like that, right? And if you're not able to sort of recruit folks to be allies in the room ahead of time, I found it to be like a little more soul restoring when people come up to me afterwards and be like, wow, that guy was really a jerk, right? Like, he didn't treat you fairly. I thought, so like, I just, if they're being if it seems to you like they're being a jerk, it's probably obvious to other people too. And you may find that you're going to get those kind of allies after the fact, even if they weren't ones that you had going in.
Okay, I have one more question, and then I'm going to make a brief announcement and we'll wrap up. So the question comes from Nora Slaninsky, who says, okay, so on the other side of the experience of attending conferences, do you have any recommendations for what mid-career scholars or nearly mid-career scholars can do day to day to make the conference more welcoming to new attendees?
I say treat them like human beings. This has been my theme this whole time, right? Like when there's if you're a mid-career or a senior person, right, at a conference, right, and you see someone looking shy and awkward and like they need a connection, like that's great that you reach out to them, but like don't just ask them about their work, right? Don't just ask them about their like I think that that can often feel a little bit like, like prelim exams again. You know what I mean? Like you don't, I think that's important that you don't want to make sure you want to make sure that the interaction is not like a senior scholar, testing out the intellectual bona fides of a junior person, right? So what I try to do in moments like that is to approach the person to make a human connection, right? Oh, where are you from, right? Like, like I don't know, like just whatever dumb normal stuff you talk to about anybody, about family, about pets, about kids, about hobbies, about background, childhood, whatever it is, right? And like, and then let the conversation flow into like the intellectual stuff from there. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, but like I personally speaking, I try never to lead off with like, what do you work on? Right? Because I don't want it to feel like a senior scholar, putting a junior scholar through their paces. Because like that doesn't build the social connection or the community, right? And then like allow the conversation about the work to emerge organically out of a human connection.
And this is, maybe something also that the mentorship program can work on. It's sort of orchestrating opportunities for these kinds of social and intellectual uh, 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 moments of connection. I mean, one of the things that we did in the program last year that was just an idea that was generated by a very junior scholar, someone who was on the program committee who was still a graduate student. And he organized this great there was a couple two-part panels, and he specifically asked, can you schedule them before and after lunch? Like, so one panel was before lunch and the other panel, and it was, scholars from all over the world, scholars from all levels of the profession. And the idea was we'll have one conversation and then we'll go break out and have lunch together and, just talk about it. And then we'll go reconvene, for the second part of the panel after lunch. And there were two sessions like that. So, figuring out ways that we can actually, orchestrate these moments of sort of social and intellectual crossover where you can actually, like Will says, get to be human beings together for a while.
Oh, that is such great advice. Thank you both so much. And really, really, thank you both so much. And I just have one more announcement that I want to make. I'm going to share my screen here. Um, so, if you are interested in joining us and finding your people, please email me and let me know if you would like to join a SHEAR Zoom meetup sometime in June. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Tell me about the kinds of connections you might like to make. And I will try to pair you with a small group of other people where you can get to know each other just a little bit before the conference and then meet up in Providence in July. I would love for you to join us. The other thing, if you are coming to the SHEAR conference in July, is please come to the early career mentorship reception. It's free. It's a really wonderful event. You can meet other people. It's organized by three amazing people, and all you have to do is sign up for it. It doesn't cost you anything in addition to attending the conference. It would be a great time for me to meet you and for you to meet the many other people involved at SHEAR. And then finally, again, this new mentorship program is just getting off the ground, and our ears are open to all kinds of ideas, all kinds of suggestions for what would be a meaningful way for people to get together to find your people. And so please let me know what I can do to help you there. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wrap up. Once again, oh my goodness, Honor and Will, thank you so, so much. Thank you to the HRC at VCU for helping stage this whole thing. And I hope to see you all in one way or another or talk with you over email.